you're weaponizing the dollar. You're taking it too far, and you're going to get a backlash. How many times can you punch the punching bag before the punching bag gets up and walks out of the room? I told him this like 7, 8 years ago. David Dollar takes his hands, he takes both hands and slams them on the table, palm down, boom. And he goes, the US dollar has been the global reserve currency. It is the global reserve currency, and it will always be the global reserve. And I said, David, I feel like I'm in Whitehall in 1913 listening to John Bull say, sterling is the global reserve currency, and it always will be, etc. But hubris is a good word. In plain English, taking it for granted. I mean, if you take your status for granted, then you can do all kinds of crazy stuff and not worry about it. But you can't take your status for granted. You have to earn it every day. We got the trust. We started with the trust earned, like I say, since 1791, but we blew it. And I've always said, and I told government officials this, I said, I don't really think our adversaries can destroy the dollar, but I think we can do it ourselves. And I would have said, and I have said, in discussing could China be the global reserve currency, whatever, and I don't have to repeat it, but I went down all the elements and mechanics and hedging of a bond market big enough to absorb global savings. And the Treasury has that. And I said, China's not even close. China's not going to be global reserve currency for, I don't know, maybe never. They don't have any of those things. They don't have primary dealers. They don't have auctions. They don't have a large bond market. They don't have a rule of law. But then in thinking about the BRICS currency, I had another one of these moments where a light bulb goes on. I said, I was writing or something and doing some research on World War I. Basically, the history of government finance of war is what I was looking at. And I saw this Liberty Bond poster. And it was, Lady Liberty, Statue of Liberty with a torch. And she, instead of the tablet, she had like a Liberty bond. And she was like, come on, America, we got to win the war. Buy Liberty bonds. And in my book, The New Great Depression, which came out in 2021, was half the book was about the pandemic. Half was inflation, deflation, but the other half was the pandemic. And one of the issues that came up, because I said, well, it's kind of a new pandemic. Why don't I read about the old one? And I read 4 or 5 books on the Spanish flu of 1918. And one of the vignettes was, they didn't know until 1930 what caused the Spanish flu. They didn't know what a virus was really until the electron microscope. But they had a sense that it spread around. And so in Philadelphia in 1917, there was going to be this big parade to buy Liberty bonds. It was like a freedom, win the war pep rally. And all these doctors at the University of Pennsylvania and elsewhere were like, don't do this. You're going to get 100,000 people on Broad Street and they're all going to die of the Spanish flu, in effect. And they went ahead anyway. They did it because for 2 reasons. One, that's how important it was. But 2, there was more extreme censorship than there is today. I know that sounds like it can't be true, but it was. They were arresting people. You couldn't write a newspaper article about the Spanish flu because it was considered bad for morale in terms of the war. And in fact, the reason it's called the Spanish flu is that Spain was not in World War I. They were not a belligerent. So their newspapers like, hey, we got this flu, and they were writing all about it. And the rest of the world's like, hey, I read the Spanish newspaper said they got a flu. So they called it the Spanish flu, even though Spain had nothing to do with it. But they were the only country that was allowed to talk about it. But what that did, if you look at the history of, these are some old names, I'm just, been around a while, E.F. Hutton, Dean Witter, Merrill Lynch, when were these firms founded? It was around 1910, 1912, 1914, and a little bit later in some cases. But the Liberty Bond was the beginning of the retail investing market. Prior to World War I, U.S. wars were always financed by big shots. Stephen Girard financed the War of 1812. Nicholas Biddle financed the Revolutionary War. James Cook financed the Civil War. There had these dealers who did it, but that all changed around World War I. So my point being, there's an example, contrary to everything I just said about China building a top-down bond market, and I don't think they can do it. Here's an example of a bottom-up bond market, where you basically got retail investors to buy into these bonds. And if you get enough of them, you're going to have a bond market because somebody will start making a market in it. And let's say you go to a typical Brazilian and you say, hey, you got 2 choices. You can buy a Reis-denominated bond, or you can buy a BRICS-denominated bond. That's not going to happen overnight by any means, but I think there is the potential for an indigenous bottom-up retail bond market in the BRICS currency for the reasons I mentioned, that over time, sooner than later, perhaps could could give you something like a reserve currency status. So this thing is so well thought out, and they've even things that I would have objected to as recently as a couple of months ago. I said, well, it won't happen because I'm like, I've now modified my because. I'm like, no, actually, it could happen. But they've built their own fiber optic submarine cable. They call it BRICS cable, and because the U.S. is very good at tapping these things, I actually did a job once where I had to figure out all the global telecommunications in the world through cable. It was a long story, but there's something called CWE, which is C is Southeast Asia, we is Western Europe, and me is Middle East. So CWE is basically the cable system that connects Asia and London. And then there's a separate one that goes from London to States. I know where it goes. I can't say, and I know where the Middle East choke points are. And again, I won't say those. But the point is, if you cut that cable at one of those choke points, or you go off in somewhere in the Mediterranean and cut that cable, you shut down internet communications between Europe and Asia in a heartbeat, and by extension, the United States. A more sophisticated version is to tap them. Easier said than done. Every now and then the internet will go out and go, some problem with the internet. It's like, well, no, you're tapping the cable and it'll be back up in a couple of hours. So the BRICS know this, and they are laying their own cables. Now, easier said than done in terms of protecting them, but they want to have encrypted, secure communications and payment channels. Again, we kicked them out of, interbank payment systems. They ended Visa. Visa's no good in Russia. MasterCard's no good in Russia. The banks can't transact in dollars, certainly. Okay, this is the 12th largest economy in the world. It's the largest landmass in the world. It's the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, etc. But you're saying you can't be part of the international payment system. Well, there's a simple solution to that, which is build your own. That's what they're doing. And you also it won't be a local currency. What I mean by that is when you go to China, you'll still use yuan. To Russia, you'll still use rubles. And there it does vary from the euro, because in Europe, you use euros in all these countries. That's okay. The important thing is the countries, when they settle trade deficits and surpluses or do purchases and sales between and among themselves, they'll do it in BRICS. And then that's much better than getting yuan or rubles. But again, you go to China, you'll still use yuan. So the yuan's not going away, the ruble's not going away. Who cares,
Thank you for tuning in to this fascinating interview with Jim Rickards. We've delved into the intricacies of global finance, the potential shifts in reserve currency dynamics, and the geopolitical maneuvers shaping our economic future. Jim's insights, drawn from his extensive experience and unique perspectives, highlight the critical importance of understanding and adapting to these changes. Whether it's the historical parallels with the past or the emerging strategies of nations today, it's clear that the global financial landscape is in flux. Stay informed, stay prepared, and as always, keep questioning the status quo. If you enjoyed this discussion, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more thought-provoking content. See you next time.